For our COBT friends, it's Maynard, Mike, and Todd here with a really exciting discussion today on batteries and battery technology. We've got Chris Mohajer with us. Chris is the director of battery research at US Capital. He's been doing battery research there for almost 3 years now. Before that, he's had a number of stops in industry, both battery and energy. On top of that, he was also for a number of years at the California Clean Energy Fund that the state founded. And so he has a number of perspectives around energy, but in particular, we're obviously grabbing him to talk about batteries today. And he's got some introductory materials that will take us from batteries 101 to batteries 301. Chris, we're delighted to have you. Really appreciate you joining us. And you're right there in the Veriton studio. So it's just welcome. Glad to have you.
Thanks so much for having me today. I'm glad to talk batteries and happy to go deep on these.
Well, this will be exciting. As we jump into talk batteries, Mike, what would you tell us about these markets we're living in right now?
Maynard, I was thinking about this over the weekend, what I would be saying, and I thought I was going to come in and say markets are really volatile. You know, we need to be cautious, and actually markets are really, really calm. If you look at the equity markets are up a couple hundred today, but, since Friday's close, equity markets are up. Bond markets are up. Volatility is down. And crude oil prices, you would have expected there would have been a nice rally. They're up $2.50. And so what really concerns me is that how calm it really is. I mean, I was listening to CNBC this morning and Paul Tudor Jones was on there and he said, literally, this geopolitical environment is the most challenging and threatening he's ever seen, but yet markets are up, volatility is down. So I think you got to be a little bit cautious because we don't know where this is going. So that's point number one. As we think about, where the bond market's going to probably be going here this week, you're going to have the PPI reported tomorrow, the CPI reported on Thursday. So those are going to be big events for the market to dictate, what the Federal Reserve is going to be doing. And that obviously is going to affect the equity markets as well. I think from a crude oil standpoint, the OPEC meeting was behind us last week. And the only thing I see in the markets this week is everyone's going to be washing Cushing inventories, right? I mean, most expect Cushing's going to basically build a little this week. Some of the traders I talk about think there's going to be a big draw. So I think that's what the market's going to be focusing on tomorrow, the DOE report. As it relates to just sort of equity things that have been going on here, obviously at the beginning of the week or late last week, we heard about the Exxon Pioneer rumor. Nothing has occurred, but I think, the key is consolidation is going to continue to happen in this industry. And I think that's a good thing. I think the other thing we're looking at is a week from now, the oil service earnings, Q3 earnings are about to kick off. So we're really going to be watching that and see what they say about the environment. So, that's what's really going on in markets right now. And so, like I said, markets are very, very calm. That concerns us a little bit. So we'll go ahead and turn it back to you, mate.
Mike, just a question for you. Do you think that investors and particularly large investors think that all this geopolitical attention, ironically, it decreases the chance of more tightening? Because why would we be tightening into a scary world like that? And then they take some solace from maybe this means a slowdown or a elimination of that next tightening. Is that at all going on here?
No doubt. You saw the 10-year bond got up to almost, 485, 490 on Friday. It's down about 15 to 20 basis points today. So I think, what markets are assuming is that the Fed is going to have to basically ease off the interest rate hikes. That's why I think that, tomorrow's PPI and Thursday's CPI are going to be important. If they come in a little bit hotter than expected, then I think you're going to have some concern that the Fed is going to have to continue. But you're right. I think that's what's driving the markets right now is the bond market is driving the equity markets, not vice versa.
Interesting. Todd, as we turn to batteries, what would you throw into the discussion? You obviously at our shop are seeing many, many, many new technologies, including batteries.
Thanks, Maynard. And I was just doing some background research and thinking about, okay, what are some of the trends we'll talk about? And so it was an interesting thing to think about because you've got some real positives and then you've got some other sort of real headwinds. And so on the positive side, if you look at how much money we're investing in new battery technology, manufacturing, production, distribution, I just did a quick Google search and it's something like $90 billion in the first 2 years of Biden's term. term, this first term, and that's before the impact of the IRA really kicks in. So you've got a huge amount of money. If you do just a quick glance of stats, in Europe in August, more than 50% of all vehicles were either fully EV or hybrid. Less than 50% were internal combustion engines. Clearly, they've had some pretty accelerated goals for what they want to hit there. And
Todd,
then
you were just talking about August sales. Is that what you were saying?
Yes, August sales were over 50% EV or hybrid, not internal combustion engines. And then one of the last things, and we talk about this a lot, on COBT, is as the power grid has changed and we've integrated a lot more intermittent resources and a lot, fewer baseload resources, the need for batteries has gone up a ton. So you have these real positive tailwinds. On the other hand, Mike just talked about geopolitics. I think it's inevitable that we start thinking about, okay, where do the raw materials for all these things come from? How are they sourced? How are they produced? What do we think about that? I think that could be a much bigger issue than people understand. And then I do think there's a couple of pullbacks going on in kind of the broad adoption of new energy sources. You saw the UK recently roll back or delay their EV mandate. You've seen a bunch of wind projects get canceled on the East Coast, where the developers are pretty brazen about saying these projects only happen if consumers are willing to pay more for energy. And then there have been a couple news articles lately about a slight decrease in consumers' willingness to want to buy EVs. And so you kind of add it all up and you say, boy, there's a lot of reasons to think more about this, to pile in, but there's also some really good reasons to be cautious. And I'm sure we'll talk about all of that a lot more, but that's just some of the background I was thinking about before we jump in today. Awesome.
Fantastic. Well, Chris, there you have it, a little bit of a market lead in and some battery thoughts. As I mentioned in the intro, you've had an interesting background around energy. I should mention you're a Longhorn. Sorry about last weekend, but it was a heck of a game. But you've got some great background. You had this experience with the California Clean Energy Fund, and now you've been doing batteries for almost 3 years. Before we jump into some of your slides, which are going to really help us go through all this, what would you tell us about your own kind of personal interest in batteries and what drew you to it and what gets you excited each morning as you think about batteries, with kind of the excitement for you personally of being so heavily engaged with the battery world?
For sure. So I like to describe myself as an accidental battery guy. So back in 2013, I was working at the California Clean Energy Fund, like you said. And this company had made around 40 different early stage venture capital investments. And I started looking through the portfolio, trying to see what stood out, where there was value, and where should we really focus our attention. One of those companies ended up being a flow battery company. And most flow batteries are batteries on the grid. And at the time, I was like, the only thing I knew about batteries was the difference between a AA and a AAA. Like, I didn't know anything about batteries at the time. But I went deeper into this flow battery company, what it could do. And I was like, oh, wow, batteries really are a key piece for decarbonizing the grid. So went back to the portfolio, looked deeper and deeper into the grid, and found this EV startup. Looked at the EV company, what they're doing, kind of their battery tech. Oh, wow, batteries are really important for decarbonizing transportation as well. Turns out that EV company was Tesla. We were in their Series C, which was kind of cool to be in there and see what happened in the early stage. But that kind of got my interest in batteries, kind of learning about batteries there, seeing how important they were for decarbonization. After that, a recruiter reached out to me for this German company named Digatron Power Electronics, and they did battery test and formation equipment. So this was a company that kind of, if you want to be in a gold rush, you want to sell shovels, you don't want to dig for gold. So they sold the test and formation equipment to all the battery makers. To think about the big tech companies, think about the automakers. They kind of supplied all these companies with the equipment. So that was a great ground floor experience to go to the engineering rooms, go to the labs, talk to the people on the floor, developing the next generation of batteries, seeing, okay, wow, Porsche Taycan comes out, 800 volt architecture. That's a big deal. Why that matters, why that moves the needle. That was a great experience. And then, like you said, joined US Capital in 2013, kind of covering the battery space, covering other names as well, but really helping educate folks on the batteries, why they matter. They're not perfect. They're not this kind of panacea that's going to fix all of our problems, but they are universal. They are a great enabling technology for things. And I think just helping people realize how many batteries are everywhere. Like the mics we have today have batteries in them. Everyone's iPhone has a battery. Like your AirPods case has a battery in the case and then 2 batteries in each ear pod, all your car keys has a battery. Batteries are universal now. And I think they're one of those things you only really think about when they don't work. Like no one thinks about the lead acid battery in their internal combustion car until your car won't start, So batteries are everywhere. And it's kind of, I would say, a testament to their success that you only think about them when they fail.
So Chris, you bring up an interesting point, which is, I think when batteries come up in our life, in our world today, it's usually in the context of a transition type conversation. You're talking about either EVs or you're talking about backup power when the wind and the solar is not working. But the battery industry is much broader than that and has many more applications than that and has a much longer history than that and has dynamics to it. Like when they say you are the battery guy, where are the boundaries? Like how do you focus in on what part of the battery world you really focus on?
And that's really the tough question, is that the market is so broad. And so I've kind of chosen to focus more on the stationary side and the automotive side, because there are tons of different niches that are very, very niche. I mean, medical batteries, for example, like pacemakers have batteries inside humans' bodies. Like that's a very niche battery. For defense applications, like every military jet, submarine, plane, missile, all of those have batteries. That's a little too niche. Consumer electronics, that's kind of a different, huge market, but not what I'm focused on. I'm really doing the stationary and the transportation side, because those are the larger markets now. I mean, for the longest time, up until a few years ago, consumer electronics was the largest market, but now it has moved towards transportation.
So maybe as we just a last thought before we kind of move into some of your slides and get us all smarter. As you were moving, you had this interesting background. You go to U.S. Capitol, you become the captain, the battery captain. How did you use, I know there's some big battery companies, Panasonic, Samsung, etc. How did you decide to attack the battery space? Because you've gone from, as you say, from the accidental battery guy to a battery expert. How did you attack it? What did you find as the best sources of information? What's the one-stop shopping for learning about batteries? And then, of course, there's all this, Todd alluded to it, all this private capital going into these new battery technologies. Just how did you attack the space?
I mean, that's what's so tough about it, is there's not one source of truth. I mean, if you look at batteries on the grid, I think EIA is a pretty good source.
Oh, Chris, I disagree. There's Veriton.
Okay. I would say U.S. Capital is a great source too for batteries, but
and U.S. Capital.
On the grid right now, I think EIA is a good source, seeing what they're putting out there. I mean, look at the individual grids. You can look at ERCOT or CAISO, seeing the data they put out there. They're different for the supply chain. I think Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, they've been really good about saying, okay, here's where the electrodes are being made. Here's the lithium prices. Here's what's going on here. That's really the big issue. There's not one source of truth. I mean, there's different consulting houses doing things, different investment banks putting out reports, but the battery space is so broad in the sense that it touches metals and mining. It touches the industrial space in terms of the refining. It touches the manufacturing side, touches the auto side, touches the utility side. So if you look at like all the different II sectors, it crosses several of those. It's really a strange space to cover from that perspective. And it also crosses over to consumer tech because it powers so many of those. So it really is a really wide space that you do have to choose your focus, because if not, you can be overwhelmed by what's out there.
When you deal with people who are curious, do you get more questions more broad-based about technologies, or do you get more questions related to, so is this specific company, doing it right? Like when you're feeling the world's appetite for battery knowledge, is it more technology-based or more specific, type company or that type context?
I say it's both. I mean, a lot of folks are realizing battery is important. So they're trying to learn about the space, kind of the 30,000 foot view, trying to learn the big pieces, what matters, they need to pay attention to. But some have gotten more in depth of saying, look, here are all these public equities out here. What do I need to know about these? What's different? How do they differentiate themselves? They're learning on that space as well. So it's kind of shifted more to individual companies, but historically it has been mostly the macro side.
Well, why don't we jump in? You've got maybe give us an introduction. You've got some cool slides that are part of a summary pack you did. Maybe just orient us to what led you to do this and how it's played a role in you talking to people about batteries.
For sure. So I would say early last year, we published a piece called a battery macro piece, which kind of gave our overview of the battery industry. I think it's around 50, 60 slides, kind of giving what we think is important to investors who are new to the battery space. It kind of, we wanted to be comprehensive and yet still be comprehensible. You know, we didn't go into the detail of what like perovskite is or kind of NMC 811 versus NMC 622, all these kind of acronyms you can throw around. We wanted to say, here's what matters in the battery world, and here's how you go through it. Because one of the problems we saw was that you could have these big industry reports saying, here's how many batteries were sold in this one county in Alabama in 2012. Or you could have some report from, let's say, some researchers saying, here's really in-depth on one chemistry. What did we like kind of bridge that gap, say, here's the big picture, here's what you need to know. And so instead of boring your audience going through 70 plus slides today, we picked our favorite 10 to kind of go through and give an overview of kind of what's going on here. This first one here is, I guess, is the one I like to kind of give an overview about is that when most people talk batteries, they think the lithium ion battery. That's the battery that's in your phone, that's in Teslas, that's in kind of all the consumer electronics out there. And that's the battery being put on the grid now. But the lithium ion battery was only introduced in 1991. So in 1991, Sony introduced the lithium ion battery, and that allowed you to move the handy cam. You can think those big, like kind of recorders you'd use to record home videos, allowed you to move from the shoulder to the palm of your hand. And so that was really what lithium ion enabled. And from there, they've kind of taken off, powering our iPhones, our laptops, and now our cars, and now our grid. But there are actually tons of other chemistries out there. This is not comprehensive at all. Of course, you have the alkaline batteries that power our AA, AAA batteries. You have zinc batteries that are used in hearing aids. You have flow batteries. You have new customers kind of doing those, like Form Energy doing alternative chemistries. But these are kind of the four main rechargeable batteries we've had around for a long time. And I think people often forget that lead acid batteries really are ubiquitous. If it moves, it probably has a lead acid battery. Like every car, every airplane, every boat, it's like I mentioned submarines earlier, they all have lead acid batteries. And like almost every cell phone tower as well has a lead acid battery in it as a backup in case the power grid goes down. What's interesting is to date, most EVs have also had a lead acid battery. I know that's caused some problems for the Mach-E, where the actual main battery would drain the lead acid battery too quickly. Tesla has started to kind of walk away from that and use a different, like a secondary lithium ion battery for that. But that's kind of what's been out there for a while. NiCads have been around since the 50s. These were kind of the batteries that were used for early portable radios, electronics, and a lot of military applications. Today, they're kind of having a renaissance in aerospace after Boeing had the fires with their 787 using lithium ion. We've seen a lot of new airplanes go back to nickel cadmium and nickel metal hydrate. That's what the original Prius used. So all these batteries have been around for a while. And I think people forget that, okay, lead acid, they've been around since 1859. Well, there were actually EVs around the time of the Model 4, the Model T was out, you had the Detroit Electric EVs. Like there were EVs back then, but they didn't win for a variety of reasons. But that's a long way of saying we've had batteries for a while, and they go back even longer than this. But this is a quick little refresher to say batteries are not new. They've been around for a while, but lithium ion is actually pretty new.
Hey, Chris, I think I might know this, but the lead acid battery, has that really changed much, you know, like from a 1950s lead acid battery to today, or is that technology pretty much been the same forever?
It's pretty much been the same. I mean, they're the workhorse. I mean, we still use them because they can withstand the abuse of an internal combustion engine. I mean, you're putting them in the engine bay of your car, taking the vibration, the heat, all that abuse. And so they're really just these little plastic tins, have some lead plates, throw some sulfuric acid in it. It's been pretty rock solid, I'd say. The one main advance we've made is how recyclable they are. I mean, some people think that lead is probably the most recycled element on the periodic table, given the fact that in the West, we when you go like buy a new car battery, they have that fee on the little receipt saying, we're going to take your old one back and recycle it. They do have pretty much a closed loop system of, okay, we're going to shred the plastic, reuse the acid, take the lead, recast it. So there is a kind of a circular economy there for lead acid already. And that's really the thing that's changed, is kind of having that circular economy. Unfortunately, that's only really here in the West. And a lot of places, let's say in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, we don't really recover all those lead acid batteries yet, but in the West, we do.
Okay.
On this slide, I would say this is, if we take away one thing from this conversation today, I would say this is the slide I want you to pay attention to. And that's just the basic simple thing, is that batteries are all about trade-offs. Like that's the main thing I want people to take away, is batteries are about trade-offs. And one of the ways you can kind of talk about this is that there are several metrics that you can use to measure batteries' performance. You know, in the previous slide, we talked about both volumetric and gravimetric energy density. This is, for example, for a given space, for a given weight, how much range can that battery provide? So that's kind of the two things to show the previous slide. But there's actually a lot of these. And this matters because lots of startups will come around and say, look how great we are. We are so great at these 3 or 4 metrics. What they're not telling you is the other metrics they're not great at. And so there's actually a saying in the battery industry called liars, damn liars, and battery suppliers. That's just, they're out there because a lot of these startups have a penchant for kind of stretching the truth. They will have a press release or something else out there like, look how great we are, but they're not telling you the full story. And I think this is one of the ways you can kind of help describe why, if you pay attention to the press, you'll see articles almost every week claiming to have the next battery breakthrough, claiming to have the holy grail for batteries. And yet my iPhone still can't last a day. Like, where's that disconnect? Like, what's going on there? And this is the main reason, is that you have to optimize for all of these things. So for example, right now, most Teslas, I think, have a 300-400 mile range. You could make a Tesla today that had 1,000-mile range, but you're going to have to trade off on some of these. Maybe instead of taking a few hours to charge, maybe it takes 3 weeks to charge. Maybe instead of going really quick 0 to 60, it's really slow. Maybe after a year, the battery would just completely die. So you can do these things. The trick is making a battery go good at all of these things. And I think that's really the core thing that I think some people can get mixed up on batteries if you're new to the space, is that you can't just look at 1 or 2 metrics. You have to look at everything.
For people that are listening, we're talking about energy density, thermal stability, room temperature, heat and cool. But one of the things you said a minute ago about how long the lead acid battery has been around, how it's such a workhorse, you can actually stick it right next to this internal combustion engine.
For sure.
We don't really worry about the thing blowing up. When you see some of these new technologies, and this question is probably too hard to answer, but when you think about some of those second order things, okay, thermal stability, room temperature, does it need to be kept hot or cold? What kind of material is packaging it? How long does it seem to take for some new technology to truly kind of go through the ringer and you really have an understanding of some of these impacts? And again, lead acid has been around now for 150 years, lithium ion for, what do we say, 35 or 40, so my supposition is it takes a really long time. Like, where do you think we are with some of the newer technologies?
Yes, you are definitely correct. And that's one thing that I think a lot of people misunderstand, is think, oh, here's new chemistry, in a year or 2 we'll be ready. No, most of these new technologies take at least a decade, sometimes 2. I mean, a decade is kind of the rough thing you should think about, is how long a new technology will take. And I think the best analogy I have for this is kind of going back to food, talking about pizza. I mean, one analogy I talk about with some people is that when you see these press releases or see some new technology, it's often made in what's called a coin cell. Think about the battery the size of like 2 quarters stacked on top of each other. So pretty small. And that's like the equivalent of like making pizza, like a pizza bagel at home. It's a really small thing. Anyone can do it. You don't need any specialized tools. You can put some stuff on there. You can throw it together. But if you want to go all the way up to running a Domino's, which is what making batteries at scale is, there's a lot of steps in there in the middle where you could have hiccups, So for example, if you want to start making full scale pizzas at home, making a lot of them, you start realizing your tools aren't right. Like your oven's not hot enough. You can't get the supply chain right. It's really tough. And then going to your own little pizza restaurant in between, well, it's not really about kind of cooking anymore. You have to do supply chain. You have to manage logistics, equipment, labor, like kind of going from these small coin cells to making batteries at scale is really, really tough because of all those hurdles you have to go through in scaling up. It really is completely different manufacturing, completely different tools, different supply chains. And then on top of that, all these different trade-offs you have to manage. Jumping into cathodes, I think there are 2 different electrodes in a battery. There's the cathode and the anode. And to date, most of the effort, most of the discussion has been about the cathode side. So you'll see people talking about, oh, does this have an NMC battery? Does this have an LFP battery? And so this is where most of the work has been to date on batteries. And so almost every consumer electronics device uses what's called LCO, lithium cobalt oxide. And this is a lot of cobalt in the battery because quite frankly, it's really, really good. But the problem is when you have a tiny battery in an iPhone versus a huge battery in a Tesla, you don't want to be using that much cobalt because, to be honest, most of the cobalt comes from the Congo, and a lot of that comes from artisanal mining, which is a euphemism for saying mined by hand by children, which is obviously something we want to avoid, not a good look for ESG. So trying to go away from that. So a lot of companies are trying to get away from cobalt in their batteries. And so that's where things like NMC and NCA come in handy. They do have cobalt still, but it's a much lower amount of cobalt in the battery and kind of ever decreasing. And then there's also LFP, which is kind of popularized for power tools, now coming to stationary storage, and now coming into EVs. And what's interesting is that LFP was for the longest time thought of as this kind of low cost battery, only really going to be used in China, not going to kind of take over the West. But now we're seeing Ford announce their low cost F-150 will use LFP. Tesla's low cost Model 3 uses LFP. Rivian's low cost vehicles are using LFP. It really is having a renaissance. Even though it doesn't have the range, it is safer and cheaper and has no cobalt and no nickel. And so that really is seeing a renaissance now in the West.
So, Chris, you just mentioned it, but on cobalt, and we hear about this as well, people trying to make batteries without cobalt or less cobalt. Is that just completely driven by, I'd rather not use a product that, comes from these types of methods, or are there technical reasons for it as well?
I say it's a little bit of both. I mean, cobalt, the fact is it's good for a battery. It helps it be very stable. But from a cost perspective, number one, it's quite costly. And two, like you mentioned, is kind of the unstable supply chain is the other issue. So it is driven by, I would say, a little bit of both. And
are there, occasionally you'll hear about cobalt in other places, Utah, I think I heard at one point, or do you see any potential for new sources of cobalt?
There's been some talk about in Canada. I mean, Canada is blessed with a lot of natural resources when it comes to energy transition critical minerals. So we'll see if they decide to go for those. And I guess we'll kind of touch on this later. But one thing I would say is that we have plenty of minerals in the ground for the energy transition. The question is, can you get them out at what cost? Can you get through the permitting? I mean, trying to build a mine in this country is quite difficult, going through the permitting, the NEPA reviews, everything else. So it really comes down to a question of cost and timelines, not necessarily the geologic quantities of these materials. So I mentioned kind of how cathodes have been what we've been focused on to date. What's interesting now is that almost all the energy is going towards the anode. And so almost all anodes in batteries today are graphite. I don't think most people realize that a lot of this graphite is what's called synthetic graphite, which is you take petroleum coke and you spheritize it and kind of use that in a battery anode. I don't think a lot of people realize that. But we're trying to switch graphite. Graphite's fine in that it's stable, it works well, but it doesn't hold that much energy. And so there are two real materials kind of competing to be the next anode. One would be silicon and one would be pure lithium metal. And these are kind of the two focuses for companies out there. A lot of companies are trying to do silicon because it can hold a lot more energy. But the problem is that after you cycle it over and over again, the battery will start to swell. And that's obviously not good. Swells a lot, the battery will explode. That's obviously not great. So a lot of different companies out there are trying to do different methods to kind of help prevent the swelling, make it stable. Some of those are up there public, like Amprius is public, Innovix is public, Sila Nano, Innovate, they're still private. They're trying to do innovative methods to kind of prevent the swelling. Kind of one stopgap that's been done is kind of sprinkling silicon in the graphite anodes to kind of increase performance. So right now, Tesla has around 5% silicon, then 95% graphite in their anodes. The holy grail for batteries, what people always talk about, is going to a pure lithium metal anode. And this is because this is the highest energy density, doesn't change in volume. But the problem is that it's kind of unstable. And so this is why you hear lots of folks talk about solid state batteries. Well, the solid state separator doesn't really do much besides make the battery a little safer. The reason you do that is to enable lithium metal anodes. And so that's really the key enabler there. There are some folks trying to do solid state batteries without lithium metal anodes and some lithium metal anodes without solid state, but they really do go hand in hand. And that is what so many people have been talking about. Some people have focused on. I mean, you have QuantumScape, Solid Power SES, all kind of doing on this. Some of the privates as well. Qberg was acquired by Northvolt. They're trying to do it with a liquid electrolyte. So this is really, I don't want to say holy grail because that's overused in the battery space, but that's really where a lot of people are focusing their attention.
Hey, Chris, would you mind just for the, the battery uninitiated, maybe if we go back to the previous page, cathodes versus anodes, and because at some level they both sort of sound like what we're mixing into the battery to, make it more capable or reliable. And while you're at it, these spider charts are quite interesting.
Yeah, so I would say cathodes and anodes, those are the two electrodes in a battery. So if you think about it this way, when you charge a battery, all the ions in a lithium ion battery go to the anode side. When you discharge it, they all go to the cathode side. So those kind of ions are shuffling back and forth between those two electrodes. And that's your positive and your negative side there. So that's what's the best thing about a battery there. And those are the two key materials. I mean, there's other things out there, including the current collectors, the separators, electrolytes, but all the core materials research is around the cathode and the anode.
And these spider charts are quite interesting. You reference the industry uses them quite a lot, but you want to just do a brief intro to those?
Sure. So we talked earlier about how batteries are all about trade-offs, and this is a good way to kind of visualize the trade-offs involved. Because I think you can see, okay, here are the different things out there, but you have to kind of measure those and show them visually. And so spider charts are a good way to show, for example, for LFP. With LFP, you're sacrificing energy density, but you're actually having lower cost. So you kind of fill in more of that side. So ideally, you'd have these charts be solid blue, but there's no holy grail of batteries. They don't become solid blue. So you kind of have to pick your poison. And what's interesting to see is that I think some people will often ask, like, what's the one battery chemistry that's going to win? And the fact is, there's not going to be one that wins. They're going to have different batteries for different things. And so we're to continue to see LCO for our consumer electronic devices. I mean, some folks think that NMC will be there for most EVs. I actually think most EVs will go to LFP. We'll use NMC and NCA for those very high-end vehicles, let's say the Porsches, the supercars, your Mercedes, things like that. But I think a vast majority of vehicles will be LFP thanks to being cheaper. And quite frankly, just because the fact that most people don't need a 400-mile range in their car. I mean, I was looking at the data from DOT, like 80% of car trips in the US are under 14 miles. You know, people don't drive 300 miles every day. If you do, that's fine, but you probably don't need an EV at that point. I mean, you need probably to go into internal combustion or kind of a plug-in hybrid, something else. But on that front, we've seen some customers and some companies try to take these trade-offs and turn those weaknesses into strengths. So they'll actually do two different batteries in a one battery pack. So they'll have, okay, your LFP battery will be the battery you kind of cycle on a daily basis for, let's say, a 100-mile range of a car. And then you'll have a different exotic chemistry that has a much lower cycle life that you use as kind of the range extender for your normal battery. So kind of doing two different battery chemistries in one. So we've seen a lot of people playing around with this, but it is kind of interesting that there are so many trade-offs involved, and you're going to have to kind of pick your poison. For example, GM now, instead of taking NMC or NCA, they have an NMCA battery. They're kind of combining those two batteries, those two chemistries, doing the nickel, manganese, cobalt, and aluminum in their battery to kind of take the best of both worlds. And so we're seeing lots of creativity here, but I would say most of the work now is being done on the anode side.
So, Chris, most battery companies, do they tend to specialize in certain flavors, or is it more often the case if you make one, you make them all, and you just there's sort of synergies in having that kind of platform?
They definitely tend to specialize. So Panasonic, for example, they do the NCA batteries. They kind of came out those with Tesla. CATL, they're kind of the world's largest battery maker. We'll talk about them later. They really have focused on LFP. So people tend to focus. We've seen some people like kind of differentiate and go out there, but battery makers tend to focus and kind of focus on one. One company I think it's interesting to talk about is A123. And you kind of, to your question earlier about how long does it take for these new batteries to come to market, I think A123 is a great story of this, is that it took them 10 years to go from lab to market. So researchers first proposed LFP for a cathode in 1996, and they didn't ship their first batteries to their customers, which were actually Black & Decker for their power tools back in 2006. So that's 10 years there. But it's interesting to see is that this is not really an exception. I mean, Enovix is 16 years old. Their batteries are just hitting the market. QuantumScape is 13 years old. Their batteries aren't on the market yet. It does take a long time to make batteries. It's really tough, but I think A123 is also an interesting story about how expensive it is to make batteries. I mean, they raised $350 million in private capital. They received under the stimulus package, a $250 million grant. They were the largest IPO of 2009 and raised $370+ million. They got $130 million in tax breaks. And yet just a few years later, they filed for Chapter 11 and then were sold to Wanshan, a Chinese group, for less than the stimulus package they received. I mean, it is a really brutal business out there, and it is tough, takes a long time and a lot of money. And I think that's one thing we're kind of watching for these early stage startups is how are these early stage startups working on materials going to actually start making batteries? It's going to be a long road, and we'll have to kind of watch what happens there.
So, Chris, something like this example, there's much made of the clean tech sort of failures of this era, and I think that some people would try to would tell us all that, this is a different world we're living in now. There's a greater commitment to a lot of things. There's the IRA. It's a different mentality. There's a whole bunch of reasons why hopefully we don't have a repeat of clean tech 1.0. But how much of this do you think is clean tech 1.0 versus just a lesson, regardless of when and how you try to do things?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think looking at like clean tech 1.0, most of the money went into the supply side. There wasn't much trying to boost demand. So they're like right now with the Inflation Reduction Act, you have the EV tax credits, you have other things out there, you have governments banning internal combustion cars. There's a lot being done to boost demand for better and for worse. But back in this first boom, it was all about boosting the supply side. And I think that's kind of the core difference, I would say now. And then just seeing just the interest from governments around the world in kind of boosting net zero targets, whatever you think of those, and kind of EV targets. It really is. It seems like the world is heading there. And on top of that, I mean, you have cars like Tesla that people buy because they're good cars. I mean, a lot of folks aren't necessarily buying that to save money, or you don't buy an $80,000 car to save money on your energy bill. You buy it because you like the car, you like the tech, you like what it says about you and all those other things. And so I think there is a lot of interest in these things just from a kind of a pure technology perspective. One thing I would say here is that batteries are getting a lot cheaper. So when batteries kind of came out in the early 90s, they were $4,000 to $5,000 per kilowatt hour. And now if you look at batteries, they're around 150. So that's a 90% price decrease in the past 2 decades. But there's an exception there, which is last year, if you look at Bloomberg's data on their price data, battery prices went up for the first time since they've been doing this report, which is just an overall, we talk about inflation all the time, like inflation has started to hit the battery industry. There's a massive boom. And it's one of those things where I think a lot of people just looked at the slope of the line going down forever and assumed it would slowly approach zero. Well, that's actually not what's going on there. I mean, batteries really have started to flatten out, as back in the day, you would have material costs be 80% of the cost of be 30% of the cost of a battery. And now they're approaching 80%. It's one of those things where that kind of cost inflation kind of hit these things. But I would note that this is a volume weighted price. So this is the price that the large buyers are paying. So some automakers are paying way more than this. Some of these companies talk about their ASP way higher than that. And if I go online and try to buy a single battery, you could be paying 5 times these costs. I mean, these really are the volume weighted costs, which I think is very important to mention. The IEA has put out some forecasts about kind of the critical mineral demand and how much minerals we're going to need for all these batteries. And if you look kind of what we have now versus these scenarios in 2030 and 2040, they give 2 different scenarios. So the status quo is kind of, okay, if we keep doing what we're doing, how much is mineral supply going to increase? Or if we're going to hit net zero, how much more do we need? And it's just wild to see, like, if we're going to hit net zero by 2050, we need to 5x, or let's say 9x the amount of lithium we need by 2030, and 16x the amount of lithium we need by 2040. And that's just one of those things is like, I don't see how we hit that goal. It is just wild to see the amount of minerals we're going to need and to kind of start going for to hit these transition numbers.
And, we would agree with you on that as well. And, I think a lot of mining companies are sitting there wondering what copper demand is going to look like in the next 5 or 10 years. And, a lot of prices haven't really moved. I really want to kind of hit on this. I mean, I think probably a year ago, we were really talking about recycling being the holy grail potentially of, if we're not going to get there, we're going to have to do recycling. Kind of give us an idea of where we are in recycling. Does that make economic sense? Can it make economic sense? Do we need that going forward to really fill in this to get to net zero?
Yeah. So recycling for lithium ion is definitely in the early days. And I think a lot of it right now is they're not actually recycling whole packs. They're doing manufacturing scrap. So I think that's one of those things that is when these new battery factories get built, roughly 80% of the batteries they make end up being scrap. Not 80% yield, 80% scrap. And so all that scrap is primed to be recycled. And that's what a lot of these factories like Redwood and Li-Cycle are handling right now, is you just kind of take the scrap off the production line, put it into your shredder and pull it out. And that's what they're really focused on right now, just because the fact is, look, we haven't had EVs on the grid for that long, so we haven't been able to recycle most of those. And most of these minerals are pretty recyclable. I'd say the one exception is graphite, because graphite's an organic material. It's not just the purity that matters, it's actually the shape of it, the organic structure. So graphite's the one that we really haven't figured out a good way how to recycle yet. So lithium we can do, manganese, nickel, no problem, cobalt, no problem. it really is that graphite side of what do we do there. Talking about supply chain again, a lot of focus goes to China for saying they control the raw materials, which isn't really true. So if you look at our top right chart, I mean, they control less than 20% of lithium, less than 5% of cobalt, less than a quarter of the nickel, less than a quarter of the manganese. The only real raw material they control is graphite. Where China's hold really is on the material processing side. We call this the midstream in the industry. So this is turning that lithium into lithium carbonate, lithium hydroxide, taking that cobalt processing, the nickel processing, manganese processing, graphite processing. That's where China really has the hold on the supply chain. And that's where no one else really can match them. I mean, we've seen that start to change. So for example, the DOE's Loan Program Office gave an award to Syrah Resources to build a graphite refining facility in Louisiana. We've seen Tesla build their lithium refining facility in Corpus Christi. And it's interesting to see a lot of these have the same, say, characteristics of industrial facilities that are used in like oil and gas refining. They're big energy intensive processing plants. So it's interesting to see those go to the same kind of regions that we've seen those. Of course, China also has a hold on the cell production. They make around 70% of batteries in the world right now.
Chris, is material processing a complicated high-tech exercise, or is it something that if you're willing to build it, you can figure it out?
I would say it's on the scale of like these large industrial facilities. So you're going to need lots of energy, lots of material inputs. You need to have scale. It is technical in the sense of you need the chemical engineering, kind of dealing with those things, but it is not a semiconductor manufacturing facility. No, it's not on that level. It's more on the industrial scale.
There's every reason to believe if we're willing and if we permit it, that we could absolutely do it here.
Yeah, if we permit it, I think that is the massive asterisk I would attach.
Chris, you can't laugh at my permitting question. You know, I'm teasing you.
Yeah, permitting is one of those things. It's just it's tough.
Is there anything about it that is like, would you liken it to building a new chemical plant or a new refinery, or is there something about it that is dirtier? You know, is there some aspect of it which makes it particularly hard to permit?
I would say it's in that same vein, but I'm just more thinking broadly about mining. I mean, we've seen so many new attempts to build lithium mines around the world, and then people end up protesting. And I know, for example, Rio Tinto tried to build a mine in Serbia for lithium. The protesters there in the government, they decided to back out. So we're going to need these minerals, but I think it requires an acknowledgement on people's behalf that this involves trade-offs, and we have to get there. And I don't think we've kind of gotten there yet. Going back to cell manufacturing, I'm looking at battery manufacturing. It's just wild to see how the battery market has grown. And this is just the EV battery market sales, but we've gone from 59 gigawatt hours in 2017 to over 500 gigawatt hours last year. And that's a CAGR of over 50%. So it's just wild to see how fast this battery market's growing. And it's also wild to see how CATL has been the largest provider of batteries in the EV space since 2016. And this company has only been around since 2011, and they really have become the largest maker in the battery space. And it's also wild to see kind of how Japan, which kind of I mentioned, kind of brought the battery to the market with Sony in 1991. They've kind of fallen off the map. I mean, Panasonic was Tesla's supplier. They're still on the map, but they're pretty small. Now it really is China with CATL and BYD. You have South Korea with LG, SK, and Samsung. But the other players are really all these small Chinese companies. It really has been. And what's interesting is there's no real Western companies on here if you look.
So this page, and then a lot of our discussion has been focused more on the EV side.
Yeah.
You know, for the more you know, large scale power, solar, wind, you know, that's going to be coupled with batteries, has the sort of technology and innovation paralleled what's gone on here? Is it faster? Is it slower? You know, are we focused on the right like duration, you know, for storage? I mean, I guess my question is, we talk a lot about EVs, talk a little bit about kind of power, utility, battery adoption, scale up, all those kinds of things as well.
So I would say the EV space, the transportation space, took the batteries from the consumer electronics space and tweaked them for their needs. We're now starting to see that in the power space. So the power companies and the stationary storage developers are starting to take the batteries from the EV space and tweak those to their needs. And so, for example, we're seeing a lot more LFP being used in stationary storage because energy density, like how much storage you can pack into a given space, that matters a lot for a car. When you have massive buildings full of batteries, that doesn't matter. So they want to go for the lowest cost. That's why we've seen kind of LFP take over in stationary, and plus it's safer. So kind of that double-edged sword of being LFP taken off there. we've seen some folks kind of change the cell size to be more appropriate for storage as well. So for example, I mean, the 18650 batteries we see in the original Teslas, they're 18 millimeters in diameter, 65 millimeters tall, which is roughly bigger than AA. That size was chosen because 18 millimeters was the thickness of a computer spinning hard drive. Like, why does the computer spinning hard drive determine the battery size of a battery on the grid? Like, that's just so many levels removed of what's going on there. So we've started to see those size changes, other size changes as well. So there are some tweaks there to kind of help it make more appropriate for stationary. We've talked about the IRA briefly, and that's been wild to see the amount of battery factories announced in the US. And so if you look at the current number of battery factories operating in the US, like by our count, it's around 60 gigawatt hours. But if you look at the announced capacity, we're over 1,000 gigawatt hours. And to kind of put that in perspective, if you assume, okay, every car has on average an 85 kilowatt hour pack, that's enough for 13.6 million EVs in the US every year, which is almost all the battery capacity we're going to need. This is one of those niche spaces, I would say, in the energy transition where we kind of have just the right amount of investment. We don't have enough in the supply chain or the other things like that, but actually get just the battery factories alone, I'd say we're about right size there. But I would say that not all these factories are going to be built and none will operate at nameplate capacity. I mean, we kind of have an 80-80 rule saying 80% of these factories will be built, and around of those that do get built, they'll operate around 80% capacity factor. And so it's just interesting to see which ones here and how they're all kind of co-located in that kind of Midwest South space. I mean, a lot in Tennessee, Ohio, Michigan, Georgia, South Carolina, and not really much in the West. I mean, you have Tesla at Panasonic's Gigafactory in Reno, Nevada, Tesla making some batteries at a very small scale at their Fremont facility, and then Tesla making batteries in Austin, Texas, their facility here. But other than that, they really are co-located in that kind of Midwest/South area. We did a little fun exercise to say, okay, if all these battery factories get built, if they operate at 80% capacity factor, what does the IRA subsidies for these factories look like? So under 45X of the IRA, you get $35 per kilowatt hour if you make a battery cell, an additional 10 if you put that in the pack. And so if you put all that together, all these plants would be earning $38 billion per year in subsidies, which is just a wild number to see. And it's kind of made the US the most profitable place in the world to make batteries, which is something else. And it's one of those things. The scale of these subsidies is interesting to see, just how this is an uncapped tax credit. It doesn't matter where you buy the materials from, who you sell the battery to. As long as you do make a battery in the US, you get this tax credit. To your question about utility scale storage, it's wild to see the growth of utility scale stationary storage on the grid in the US. So 90% of the storage on the grid was that in the past 2 years. And by utility scale storage, I mean batteries larger than 1 megawatt. Batteries under 1 megawatt are counted by the EIA. That's a lot of the batteries you'll see at small C&I facilities, residential storage. This is just the big batteries out there. And I think to your question around duration, it's interesting to look at the average duration of these batteries on the grid is 2.1 hours. That's not very long. I mean, we've seen some batteries up to 8 hours be put on the grid, but really this average duration is around 2.1 hours, which is pretty short. But that's kind of my intro on batteries. I can go deeper. I mean, we have that massive, I told you, that massive battery deck I can go through and send people if they want, but that's kind of our rough overview of how I think about it and some highlights there.
No, it's fantastic, Chris, and we've loved getting to know you, and we really appreciate the folks at US Capital, lending you to us for a discussion. Maybe one question. I think everyone plus or minus in energy world knows that the power grids are getting, there's a lot of strain because there's a lot of new power demand, but there's also strain because you have unpredictable power sources have been pulled together, and that's difficult to manage. And we obviously have the intermittency issue. I think we kept talking this summer about being surprised by the heat, that we didn't get a ERCOT, real problem this summer. And I guess one of the things we've realized lately is if you buy enough batteries, and if the batteries are cheap enough, and if you supplement your system, even if that becomes costly or perhaps not the most efficient way to do it, you can patch the system and make it work. What is your outlook for batteries being an answer to these grid problems? Or could we do it with batteries?
So batteries are great for certain applications on the grid. They're not a panacea. You can't just say, okay, we have solar and wind on the grid and some batteries and we're done. Like it's not that simple as much as some people would like to think. But batteries are great for these kind of short-term fluctuations. And so I think one thing I like to think about is for a long time, a lot of these fluctuations on the grid were handled by the actual spinning generators in coal and natural gas power plants. They call that spinning reserves or inertia because the actual turbines of the plant are literally spinning, and the grid would kind of slow or speed those up to kind of help stabilize the grid. And that's where batteries really started to play on the grid in the US, is kind of that short-term duration response, responding for a few minutes, maybe 30 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, maybe even up to 5 minutes, just kind of providing power for those short durations. And over time, we've seen batteries provide longer and longer durations for different markets. So now they're doing 30 minutes, now they're doing an hour, now we're seeing some 2 hours up to 8 hours. So those short durations are where batteries really do shine and kind of help smooth out those things. And now we're seeing, for example, in California, almost every solar plant that gets built has batteries attached to it just because of the California's grid is so saturated during the sunny hours. You got to kind of time shift that power. And so from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense. But I would say batteries are not they're going to save the world or solve everything, but they are a great tool to use for niche applications. And they're growing, and that as the cost comes down, as the grid becomes more intermittent, we'll have more applications. But I do think it's one of those things where it's just, you got to use the right tool for the right job. You can't use a hammer for everything. You got to use it for the right job.
So, and Todd can comment on this because we've seen some of it, but and he's already alluded to it. But there's been a lot of capital go into battery technology, a lot of capital going into battery deployment and battery broadly. What do you notice about where the new money is going in terms of investment? Where are areas where you're most keen for some sort of breakthrough, either technologically or from a cost perspective? What would you tell us about just the capital flows into the battery world and what changes we might see as a result?
Yeah, I would say there's like 3 trends I've noticed. One is a massive influx on actually building the battery factories. We kind of mentioned, look, over 1,000 gigawatt hours of capacity announced for the US factories. Well, that's great. We haven't seen money flow into the supply chain yet. So no one's building the refineries yet. We've started some of that. No one's building the mines yet. No one's building electrode processing. That piece hasn't come up. So that's number one. On the tech side, I would say most of the focus has moved to the anode, like I mentioned. So we've seen a lot of startups on the silicon anode side raise money. If you look at the kind of the startups that these large automakers have invested in, that really is all on the anode side. They're not touching the cathode anymore. And number 3 is, I would say, there's a lot of money being put to deploying batteries on the grid. So lots of companies are created out there just to kind of go install batteries on the grid. They're not technology companies. They're really development companies, finance companies out there, buy batteries, put them in cubes, put them in containers, put them on the grid. There's a lot of money in that right now, and a lot of companies doing that around the world, but the US is definitely the leader there.
Just kind of piggyback on that's more of a private equity discussion, but just from a public investor standpoint, obviously you talk to these people. Who were those guys 2 or 3 years ago when sort of the ICLN was going up, all this energy transition, the whole world's going to be electrified, and now we've seen the cost of capital go up quite significantly. The stocks, a lot of these stocks are at all-time lows. Some are going bankrupt. Who are the people that are looking at this from a public equity standpoint today? Are those generalists? Are the people in the EV world? Is it traditional energy investors? Where was it 2 or 3 years ago, and where do you see it today, and where do you think it's going to be 2 or 3 years from now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's tough. I mean, 2-3 years ago, I think there was a lot of FOMO in the space. Everyone saw all these SPACs booming and everyone's like, okay, we can do this. And so there was a lot of just kind of people going into the space thinking they can make a quick buck. And that's really changed. The cost of capital has increased. You're seeing a lot more discipline, a lot more research being done before you make these investments. And I think there is some journalists, there's a lot of our traditional energy investors in there. But 2 to 3 years from now, I think it's tough to say. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities out there. And a lot of these companies, like you mentioned, have had rock bottom valuations now and prices have been hammered. So I think there's going to be some opportunities for people to come in and say, okay, which one of these have something? How do we recapitalize these? Do we roll these up? Will private equity roll? And I think that's going to be interesting to see what happens there, because there's a lot of, I mean, we track the SPAC market. I think we tracked 57 clean energy SPACs still trading. And I think as of Friday, only 4 of those were above their IPO price. So it's been a brutal market. And so I think it's going to change since Friday, but since Friday, 4 of the 57 were above their IPO price.
And sorry, Chris, those 57, was that 57 tied to batteries, or is that 57?
That's broader energy transition. Several of those are batteries, but it's broader energy transition SPACs we're trading. I mean, there's some that exited, but the 57 still trading, 4 were above their IPO price.
Well, as you can tell, we all have lots of questions, so it's hard to limit us here on this, Chris. But maybe I'll close with the one that's on all our minds, which is we're always thinking about 10 years from now, what does the energy space look like? As you think about batteries, how significant has the battery space? How much has the battery space grown in 10 years? How much has it affected EVs and renewables? Because we've patched up the problem. Like, when you think about batteries in 10 years, how much more significant are they as a piece of the whole energy puzzle compared to where they are today?
I think it's pretty significant. I think one of those things is we add more renewables to the grid, have more intermittency on the grid. They're going to be ever more important. As the world transitions to more EVs, they'll become more important. And even if we do plug-in hybrids, they're going to be a lot more important. I mean, we see these stats around vehicle sales in the US. I think the US for the first half of the year, around 7.5% of new cars sold in the US were EVs. But look at the actual fleet of cars in the US, we're still under 1% EVs. So this is going to be a decades-long transition of slowly ramping up supply chains, slowly putting out more EVs in the market. This is one of those things that takes a long time to transition up. This will be a multi-decades-long process, and it's going to be bumpy. I mean, we don't have the supply chain built yet. We don't have the critical mineral supply chain built yet. We're starting to do the actual batteries themselves, but you got to make sure demand is there. You got to roll everything up, not to mention there are any supply chain issues. It's going to be bumpy, but I think batteries are kind of here to stay, and they're going to find their niche and they'll be around.
So, well, I've realized the question, it's a little bit unfair, Chris, but it'll tell us everything we need to know. In 10 years, will you still be in the battery industry?
Definitely.
All right. Well, that tells us all we need to know right there. That's awesome. Well, Chris, you're fantastic to visit with you. It's great to visit with you. We love making a new friend, and we all learned a lot about batteries. We'll attach the slides, and people should reach out to Chris as they want to learn more about batteries. But this has been fantastic.
For sure. Thank you so much for having me. My email's at the end of the presentation. Shoot me an email. Always happy to nerd out on batteries. So thanks so much, guys.
Hey, that's our tagline for today. Chris is always happy to nerd out on batteries. That's good. All right. Thanks, everybody.